Okay, thanks for joining me, Rich. This is the last recording that I'm doing of these problem definition sort of sessions with experts and people who work in the democracy space. And the thing that I want to hear about from you, if that's okay, is that a lot of people in this field talk about how the person who sets the question sets the frame. And from my position, you know, from a climate perspective, there's obviously the UK Assembly on Climate had a net zero 2050 date, and that was the context, which I personally completely disagree with. So therefore, I think there's a huge problem with that assembly, aside from anything else that I might know about it or, you know, critique about it. I suppose the other point about that that's also curious to me is that somebody said to me that if they sat around and said, do you think it should be 2050 or 2040 or 2035 or whatever, actually to most people, they don't have the technical detail on the science to be able to really have a very informed opinion about that. So that's also a question about that example. But it's obvious that if you set up a thing like this, then you're drawing some boundaries and parameters and stuff, and there's a power question there. So yeah, what do you think we need to sort of learn about and think about in terms of who sets the agenda and who sets the frame?
Yeah, so it's a good question, and it is a really important question. I mean, if I think of the example of the UK Climate Assembly, my sense is what matters most, in a way, is that you're honest. So what I think is really problematic is when people say things like, get involved with us and you're going to be able to, you know, deliver net zero by 2040. But in reality, you're being invited to something which can't necessarily do that. So if, for example, you know, if we were setting up, I'm currently sitting here in Oxford, if the council were going to set up something and say we're going to, you know, get to net zero by 2040, but actually I don't know the configuration of the council in Oxford. Let's say it's got a lot of councillors who don't really want to make the major changes required to do it. So they ask some of the question and they say they're going to do it, but actually they're not really doing it. And I think one of them, when you set up an assembly in that way, there's a real risk of actually providing a kind of fig leaf of democratic legitimacy to a system that is incapable of listening and incapable of acting, and that's a huge problem. So when I think about agenda setting, it's not just about what the question is and who sets it. It's actually like, are you really capable of acting on it in any kind of meaningful way? One of the really good things about, let's say, you're a community like Hull or Stroud or Brixton, wherever you might be, people running these assemblies locally, there's a legitimacy of like, you know, we live in the community. I live here, my family lives here, and I am going to act because I care about my street, and I'm going to do stuff to make things happen within my capability. And I think if we say something like, let's say, you know, so I live in Stroud, and I might say something like, I want to get to net zero by 2040, and I myself am going to do everything in my power to do that. I'm not a councillor, I'm not a big business owner, I don't have lots of money, but I've got my time and my energy, and I'm going to commit to act on what's coming out of it. That's honest. It's an honest contract. And I think that's my kind of initial kind of response to that. And then my other response is like, depends where you're at in the process. So when you're starting these processes, there's a way in which that I think that what's most important is you're asking a question that matters to the community you're talking to. So if you're gonna set up an assembly, wherever you might live, you need to ensure that you're asking a question that people really, really care about. And I think one of the ways these things go wrong is let's say it's a bunch of climate activists who come together. They say we want to get to net zero by 2030 or whatever it might be, but actually in that place they're about to shut the hospital. They're going to shut it down, and all anyone really cares about is whether they're going to have to travel like an hour to A&E or an hour to whatever it is, and that's the real issue. And so I think that's a problem, you know, when we're kind of like, so I think it's really important that we are, whoever we are running these, we're really attuned to what the needs of the community are that we're trying to serve. Once you've got going, once you're in process, then I think, you've got a basis for actually asking the participants, asking the assembly members of what they want to discuss next. However, the problem is, let's say we have an assembly of 50 or 100 people for a place, like Hull or Stroud or wherever. Actually, by being in that process for, let's say, a few months, you become really special. You've learned a lot about this process, you've become activated, and you will probably not be like the people in the place that you live in. And what I recommend that people do is you do some kind of exercise. Maybe it could be a survey, maybe it could be a poll, but basically you ask. You're always trying to make sure we're really in tune with, however we can do it, what people really care about, what's really important to them. And if, for example, let's say there's an issue. So one of the other, sorry, I'm talking too much here, but one of the problems we've got at the moment with local democracy is that all of our local media is gone, right? All local newspapers are gone. So we don't know, so if I think of where I live in Stroud, I know, because I'm that kind of person, that there are quite a lot of decisions getting made that are, if not corrupt, they certainly are, there are vested interests at play that nobody knows about because there is no local media, there is no local journalism. Well, I've been thinking about how, in tandem to setting the agenda, in tandem to running citizens' assemblies, we need, in a way, community journalists to dig out the stories to ensure that we know what's going on, so we're asking the right questions.
Okay, that's really interesting, Rich, because I think also, like, it speaks to something that I'm very conscious about in terms of the visibility of the assembly. And I think the process, people are quite often say it's transparent, but if no one looks through the window, it doesn't really matter if you made it transparent or not, because nobody was paying attention. So you also have to need people to see it. But then, yeah, it sort of speaks back to the damage that's been done to our sort of information ecosystem that we live in society, and also what we've talked with Nick Gardam about quite a lot with these listening campaigns, and how you can try to get into like what matters to a lot of people before you really start doing the work and think that the work is serious, if you see what I mean. You just make a start. I like what you say, just make a start. That's okay. But over time, you've got to learn what people really care about. So that's good, because I think that's a way to hold a deeper conversation about how you do things on a national kind of level, and versus a sort of more localized, maybe more citizen-led, bottom-up type level. And that also goes back to the conversation that I've had with Graham about the relationship between, self-organized, self-built assembly processes and proper posh ones with sortition. So thanks very much, Rich. That's all. I'll see you on a round table at some time, talk about it.